The decline of Sega. What happened? Are you a gaming geek? If the answer is yes, then you already must be very well acquainted with the name of Sega. You might know them as a company that develops video games, but did you know that there was a time when Sega was known as one of the top gaming console manufacturers in the world? To know more about Sega's transition, keep watching. Hey guys, welcome back to a brand new video on my channel. Today we are going to discuss the rise and fall of one of the biggest names known to the video gaming industry, Sega. They sure have quite an interesting history with how they ended up as a video game developer from video console manufacturer. And so, without any further ado, let's get into it. The history of Sega goes all the way back to the 1940s. Back then, Sega was known as Standard Games, and they entered the industry with their standalone consoles installed at malls and shops for people to game. The way these games worked was very much dependent on the coin machines, and as their popularity grew, Standard Games merged with a Japanese company to open their shops in malls with the name Sega Zones. From there on, Sega enjoyed unprecedented rise, and their games grew so much in popularity that for some time, they became the sole owner of licenses for some of the top games. After enjoying unmatched success in the 1980s, the company saw its very first downfall when the gaming industry throughout the globe was facing several challenges, and Sega couldn't dodge the effect. So the strategists at Sega decided to come up with something that the world needed. It became the time to move away from making big, standalone gaming booths for malls and gaming zones and make small consoles that could be operated at home. By that time, Sega Enterprise had once again changed its name to Sega Electronics, with some new investors on board. The idea of making a personal and home-based console was first implemented in the first console Sega produced, named the Sega SG-1000. It was only available to consumers in Japan at the time of its release. The first console saw some good sales, so after a few years, Sega launched a second model, named the SG-1000 II. A few years down the line, the third model Sega Mark III was released. All this time, Sega was in constant competitions with the products from Nintendo, which were performing much better on all fronts. So all in all, Sega wasn't performing at a level where they could beat Nintendo. Yet Sega kept on releasing newer consoles, but that didn't change the fact that Sega wasn't very successful with what they were doing. First, they were in direct competition with Nintendo, a far more superior console, plus the gaming choices were much greater. So Nintendo became the natural choice for gamers. And one more thing that added to the failure of Sega's first few consoles was that initially they were only targeting the Japanese market. That somewhat improved when Sega launched their new console called the Sega Master System. I won't say it was a groundbreaker for Sega, but it surely did much better than the previous few consoles. The Master Gaming Console was the first one that launched in the US as well as in Japan, so it attracted more customers. But that's not it. Everything changed when Sega launched their mega hit console, the Sega Genesis. It was a huge upgrade over their Master console. The console was technically advanced when compared to both of Sega's previous products as well as Nintendo's, which at the time was the market leader. So better technology had already given them a competitive edge. But Sega added so many new games to Genesis gaming library that the customers couldn't resist. A major role in the success of Sega Genesis was playing by this new market strategy, which was very forward and aggressive compared to the strategies of their previous consoles. There is one more reason worth mentioning here, a reason for which Sega deserves all the credit in the world. It wasn't just the Genesis console, but also the world-renowned, critically acclaimed Sonic the Hedgehog video game. The game itself was so popular that everyone immediately fell in love with it. You could see people of all ages collecting those gold rings while playing Sonic on their console. Not only was the game addictive, but the interactive features of the game made it a hit in the gaming industry. Part of the reason Sonic became so successful was that the 16-bit chip in the Genesis made the gaming experience far better and more immersive as compared to playing Mario in 8-bit. So no doubt it was a success. Plus, the natural feel you get playing games on Genesis was much better than playing on Nintendo. From the attention to detail to the graphics, Everything was so perfectly integrated that Genesis pushed the sales and revenue figures of Sega upward. Unfortunately, that's where Sega peaked when it comes to manufacturing consoles. By the end of the 1990s, Sega had lost its market share in the console industry. The reason Genesis was so successful and Nintendo couldn't keep up with Genesis was because they didn't launch their new console. After all, the old one was selling just fine. But as they saw their sales figures going down, Nintendo released the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, which brought back all the sales to Nintendo. The Super Nintendo was not only a good console, but it offered a great collection of games as well. Sega could have done something to reverse the damage, but I don't know what happened at their end, as instead of taking a forward approach, their new console Saturn proved to be a big disappointment. First, it's a shame that they didn't offer Sonic with the Saturn, and second, it wasn't good enough to compete with Nintendo's offering. All of this was happening, and Sega wasn't yet able to get out of the shock that the Super Nintendo had given them. And then came the news about Sony joining the gaming industry with their PlayStation. Sega still tried to compete with the PlayStation by taking some very bold moves, but none of those moves even helped Sega. To give competition to PlayStation, Sega announced that their new console will be available without any delays, whereas there was long waiting lists to get a Sony PlayStation. But then Sega lost the pricing battle, as PlayStation was $100 cheaper than the Sega console. I guess by now Sega was experimenting with ways to stay afloat, as they had already lost the competitive edge in the market. The last nail in the coffin proved to be catastrophic for Sega, and that was their next console, the Dreamcast. The only feature worth advertising about that console was its internet connectivity option. But you see, back then the internet simply wasn't good enough to advertise a product solely based on its option of being connected. Microsoft's Xbox Live came with a similar strategy, and they also failed because their only edge that product had over PlayStation was internet connectivity, and it wasn't enough to beat the PlayStation. The original PlayStation was so successful that when news of PlayStation 2 broke, there was no way Sega could even survive. So instead of wasting money by coming up with more failures, they decided to leave the console market altogether. And that's how the journey of making gaming consoles that started decades ago for Sega came to a disheartening end. It's a shame that it had to happen like this, but Sega had no other way to go. So they transitioned from making consoles to developing games. The legacy of Sega for producing gems like Genesis consoles and quality games like Sonic the Hedgehog will always be special to the gaming community. That's it about the decline of Sega. I hope that answers your questions about everything there is to know. We value the feedback of our subscribers, so please don't hesitate to leave us a comment below. On that note, I'll end the video here. I hope you liked it. If you did, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.